Well, I'm sure by now you've all heard the terrible, awful, no good news about Brexit. It all started when Nick Soames, who I believe is the grandson of Winston Churchill and the son of the infamous Lord Christopher Soames, he defected to the Liberal Democratic Party from the Conservative Party, which cost the Conservatives their one-seat majority in Parliament and threw really all of Brexit into jeopardy. Now, this was no accident. This was Soames's sole goal. He wanted himself to stop Brexit because he thought that he couldn't live with himself if he let Brexit happen on his watch. Now, specifically, he meant a no-deal Brexit. But of course, that's the only real Brexit, because if the EU and the British government sign an agreement to part ways, that agreement will be binding the EU and Britain in perpetuity, meaning that Great Britain is still legally bound to the EU. They have whatever EU regulations that they'll still have to follow, or perhaps probably not pay any EU taxes, but still, they will be politically linked with the EU going forward if there is some kind of deal. And of course, if there is a deal, it's not going to be a very weak deal. It's going to be a deal that the EU makes sure binds Britain very strongly to them so that they maintain power over them. Now, I found it particularly interesting that it was Nick Soames, really, who has made this all really in jeopardy. Not only because he is the grandson of Winston Churchill, who of course is famous for, trying to save Britain from being dominated by continental Europe, but also because he is the son of Lord Soames, who, of course, was instrumental as the last governor of southern Rhodesia in handing over the country to the evil dictator Robert Mugabe, who ruled that country for 4 decades just about. And of course, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, is still in shambles. It's one of the poorest countries in Africa. It went from being the richest at the time that Lord Soames was the governor there. So we now have 2 generations in a row of the Soames family of really turning over 2 different nations to really terrible political leadership. In the case of Lord Soames, of course, he condemned, Rhodesia's/Zimbabwe to decades of tyranny under Mugabe, and Nick Soames now has tried, at least, to condemn the United Kingdom to an eternity under the rule by the European Union. So now that the Tories have lost their majority, the opposition has been able to seize control of the Parliament, and by opposition I of course mean the Remoaners. The Remoaners, who for months have been calling for a second referendum, decided that I guess a second referendum won't do at this point, and they just want to stop Brexit altogether. And so to that end, they passed a bill saying that no-deal Brexit now is impossible. If there isn't a deal, then the UK will never leave the European Union. And of course, this essentially means that the UK now will never leave the European Union. That, of course, is because this bill makes it impossible for even someone who supports, making some kind of Brexit deal to, in fact, make one. The Parliament has just given away all of Britain's, negotiating power, because if they're saying that they will not leave the EU without a deal, well, then the EU doesn't have to work with the UK to make some kind of a deal with them, because if the EU just sits back and does nothing and doesn't make a deal, Britain won't leave, and the status quo will go on forever. And of course, it's impossible for British to really make any demands in their negotiations, because since they have said that they will not leave without a deal, the EU knows that the UK has to accept whatever conditions they put on them. So with the passage of this one bill, the referendum, which came out in favor of Brexit, that was voted on in, what was it, 2015 or 2016, that referendum has now been overturned, and Brexit is canceled. It will never happen unless this bill is somehow overturned at a later date, or repealed, I guess would be the correct term. Because let's be clear, even if this bill didn't exist, there still wouldn't be any sort of a Brexit deal that anyone could reach, because the EU doesn't want to make this easy on Britain. The EU wants to make this very difficult. They want Brexit to be a very bad experience so that other countries who might think about leaving the European Union think twice. This really is a complete disaster at this point. The only hope now that anyone has of Brexit actually being saved is this prospect for new elections that a lot of people have been talking about. Now, Boris, of course, famously, just before this whole mess got started with Nick Soames, he said, hey, I don't want another election. That wouldn't be good. We just want to skate through, get Brexit done, and then we'll have our election afterwards. Well, now that he's lost his majority, you might understand that his tone has changed. I think that Mr. Johnson now is much more open to having an election before October the 31st, and frankly, so am I. I've been strongly opposed to having another election because I thought, hey, why jeopardize the majority while it exists? But now that the majority is gone and that, Johnson is not safe and that Parliament has voted to cancel Brexit, well, then you definitely want to get a different Parliament in there that can hopefully repeal this bill. That's the only hope at this point. Now, I'm sure Nigel Farage is very happy about all this because it means that his Brexit party will finally have a chance in the sun and they will be able to compete in a general election. Farage has been pushing for an election for some time now to try and strengthen the Brexiteer majority in Parliament so that something like this wouldn't happen. And he's wanted to form a coalition with the Tories, sort of a pro-Brexit alliance between the two parties until Brexit is delivered. And even though I think that is not a particularly likely scenario, I don't think that that's something that is that realistic, because I think that based on Farage's performance as the UKIP leader, he has trouble focusing support within districts, and that the support for his party tends to be spread evenly across the country, meaning that it would be great if if there was proportional representation in the UK. The Brexit Party and UKIP under Farage probably would have done great, but you have to win individual districts in the UK to win a seat in Parliament, just like in the United States. And because of that, I'm afraid that the Brexit Party may just end up splitting votes with the Tory Party. Not that I like the Tory Party. I'm not saying you should vote for the Tory Party. If I were in the UK, unless I was in a district where it looked like the Brexit Party had no chance, I would probably vote for the Brexit Party, since they are the ones who, actually want to get out no matter what. But I still am not certain that they're electorally viable. So on that rather ominous note, I think I'll end this for today. If you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.